Wichita, Kansas, Center City, USA. Wichita is clean air, clean water. Wichita is planned development and plenty of room to grow. Wichita is a community, compact and close-knit.
One thing that is important to know about this case is that it can be told from two perspectives. The first perspective is the one the public experienced, how it all unfolded for those looking in from the outside. To them it was a story of a serial killer, taunting police and targeting the innocent. But then there is the other perspective, the perspective of Dennis Rader. It's very different from his point of view. You have all the pre-planning, his motivations, his sexual fantasies, and his evolution from a boy who strangled stray animals to a menace. We will begin with the first perspective, and then fill in the blanks from the eyes of the killer himself. It does remind you of the Golden State Killer a little bit. I mean, they're two different types of killer for sure, but just the overall feel of the case, how it went unsolved for so long, how it was one of those mystery cases in the shadows until the killer got caught and everyone's attention was focused on the case. The Golden State Killer was a predator lying in wait in a dark corner. He didn't mind the attention, but it didn't make it one of his gimmicks, so to speak. He didn't feel the need to advertise every crime he committed. It took many years for investigators to link the cases together. BTK is different. He always wanted the attention. His ego was huge. He must have looked at the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac wasn't a sexual predator. He wanted infamy and attention. BTK is like a mix of the Golden State Killer and the Zodiac Killer. He had dark, sadistic sexual fantasies that he needed to fulfill, but he also had a need for recognition, infamy, and fear. It all began in January of 1974. On that day, the BTK killer struck for the first time, and he struck hard. From that day on, he would have 30 years of terror to inflict upon the citizens of Wichita, Kansas. That day was just like any other for the Otero family. It was January 15, 1974, and just like they usually did, 3 of the Otero kids left for school that morning. Left in the house was the father, Joseph Otero, a 38-year-old war veteran with several years of service in the Air Force. There was the mother, Julie Otero, 33 years old, and the family's 2 youngest kids were still at home. 9-year-old Joey Otero and 11-year-old Josephine Otero. They had only been living in their new home for about 6 months. They had no idea that someone was stalking them, watching them, and planning to do things only a true monster could ever think of to them. We will be revisiting the Otero murders later on in this episode, to fill in the blanks that only Dennis Rader could fill in. School was over for the day, and 15-year-old Charlie Otero and his 2 siblings were making their way home. Charlie walked to the backyard of the house and opened the kitchen door. That's when he heard his 2 other siblings shout for him. They were shouting to him that their parents were playing a bad prank on them. But it wasn't a prank, and what young Charlie found that day will haunt him forever. There was a couple things right off the bat that struck him as off. When he first had walked into the kitchen, he had seen his mother's purse on the stove, and the place was in a disarray. It never was like that. His mother was always very tidy. It was odd. But things would get odder real quick. Charlie quickly made his way to his parents' bedroom And there he got the shock of his life. There they were, his mother on the bed. She was lifeless and stale. Her arms and legs were tied behind her back. Her face looked weird. It looked dead. Charlie's father, Joseph Otero, was on the floor. He was lifeless and stale, his face purple. He had a belt tied tightly around his neck. They were both dead. Charlie didn't linger around for long. He contacted police, and it wasn't until he was at the police station that the cops told him that his little brother and his little sister had been killed too. What had happened to the Otero family? In the span of just a few hours, broad daylight, someone had subdued the family by gunpoint. The attacker had bound the two parents in the bedroom. He had put a plastic bag over Mr. Otero's head and tightened it so it would stick. After that, he went to strangle Mrs. Otero, but it wasn't as easy as he thought. It was clear that the attacker had fumbled a little bit during his first attack. Mrs. Otero had been strangled, but only passed out, and Mr. Otero had tore a hole through his plastic bag. It was a mess, but the stranger had managed to keep in control. His second attempt at suffocating Mr. Otero had worked. Then it was Mrs. Otero who was still alive. She was strangled a second time, and so she too slipped into the darkness. The stranger had taken the boy Joey into another bedroom, where he put a t-shirt over his head and then tied a plastic bag around his head. Now he got what he was there for. 11-year-old Josephine. She was the target all along, the main focus in his twisted sexual fantasies. The three other family members were all found in the bedrooms. Mrs. Otero strangled with a cord. Mr. Otero and little Joey had been suffocated with plastic bags. But Josephine was another story. The stranger had taken little Josephine into the basement. There he pulled her pants down and hung her by the neck, her legs and hands tied behind her back. As she was hung, the stranger masturbated on her, leaving semen behind him on the scene. This was his first attack. It was basically a massacre. Few serial killers are both mass murderers and serial killers. But BTK is another story. As he left, he took Mr. Otero's watch, a souvenir to relive the crimes and his sexual fantasies. The family's car was also found some distance away. The killer didn't want it to look suspicious. He had been planning this first crime. BTK had been born. He had been molded into existence like a golem. 3 men were arrested for the Otero murders, but BTK couldn't have that. Those were his victims. No one else could have them. And this is where his ego and insatiable need for recognition comes in. His need for fame. He called the Wichita Eagle and told the reporter that there was a letter stashed in one of the books in the library. The reporter was skeptical, but chose to inspect the book by themselves. And there it was. The letter said, "I write this letter to you for the sake of the taxpayer as well as your time. Those 3 dudes you have in custody are just talking to get publicity for the Otero murders. They know nothing at all. I did it by myself and no one's help. There has been no talk either. Let's put it straight. Joe. Position: southwest bedroom, feet tied to the bed, head pointed in a southerly direction. Bondage: window blind cord. Death: the old bag trick and strangulation with clothesline rope. Clothes: white sweatshirt, green pants. Comments: he threw up at one time, had rib injury from wreck few weeks before, laying on coat. Julie. Position: laying on her back crosswise on the bed pointed in the southwestern direction, face covered with a pillow. Bondage: blind cord. Death: strangulation twice. Clothes: blue housecoat, black slack, white sock. Comments: blood on face from too much pressure on the neck, bed unmade. Josephine. Position: hanging by the neck in the northwest part of the basement, dryer or freezer north of her body. Bondage. Hand tied with blind cord, feet and lower knees, upper knees and waist with clothesline cord, all one length. Clothes. Dark bra cut in the middle and a sock. Death. Strangulation once, hung. Comments. Most of her clothes at the bottom of the stairs, green pants and panties. Her glasses in the southwest bedroom. Joseph. Position in the east bedroom, laying on his back, pointed in eastern direction. Bondage. Blind cord. Clothes. Line cord with a club hitch. Death. Suffocation once, strangulation suffocation with the old bag trick. Clothes. Brown pants, yellow-brown striped t-shirt. Comments. His radio is blaring. All victims had their hands tied behind their backs. Gags of pillowcase material, slip knots on Joe and Joseph's neck to hold leg down, or was at one time. Purse contents south of the table. Spilled drink in that area also. Kids making lunches. Door shade in red chair in the living room. Otero's watch missing. I needed one so I took it. Runs good. Thermostat turned down. Car was dirty inside. Out of gas. I'm sorry this happened to society. Good luck with your hunting. Yours, truly guilty. P.S. Since sex criminals do not change their MO or by nature cannot do so, I will not change mine. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK. You see, I'll be at it again. They will be on the next victim. It was clear that the Oteros just was the beginning. The killer, the BTK killer, was taunting them and telling them that he would strike again, and that he did. But what the public didn't know was that a few months earlier, in April of 1974, BTK had claimed his fifth victim. He didn't want to claim that attack though, as the victim's brother had survived and seen the BTK killer's face. The victim that day was KATHRYN Bright, 21 years old. She was walking home with her brother that spring day, Kevin Bright, 19 years old. But as they entered the front door, the stranger came rushing from the bedroom with a gun pointed at them. He told them that he was a wanted criminal and that he just needed food. BTK first forced Kevin to tie his sister's legs and hands together, and then BTK led Kevin out of the room in an attempt to bind him as well, but Kevin wasn't going to give up without a fight. The two of them suddenly got into a fight as Kevin tried to reach the gun, and he was almost successful. The BTK streak of terror was almost ended right there, just a few months after it had begun. But BTK managed to get a hold of the gun and shot Kevin in the head twice. What BTK didn't realize was that the shots wasn't fatal. Kevin was injured and realized that his only way to survive was to play dead. While he was laying there, tired and scared, BTK got on top of KATHRYN Bright and began strangling her, but she too was fighting back. That's when he took to another method. He took his knife and began stabbing her in the abdomen. While he was plunging the knife into her, her brother Kevin managed to get up on his feet and run outside to get help. BTK was gone by the time police and ambulance arrived. KATHRYN received several blood transfusions, but died in the hospital. Kevin was in critical condition, but he survived, forever haunted by what this sadistic stranger had done to him and his sister. It was in the fall of 1974 that the letter had been found in the Wichita library, and everyone was holding their breaths. But it would take 3 years until the BTK killer committed another murder. March 17, 1977. BTK had been gone for 3 years. Silence. But just as people thought the man responsible for the Otero massacre was gone, he reappeared again. This time it was Shirley Vian, 24 years old. BTK had spotted her son outside and followed him to the home. There he had knocked on the door, posing as a detective. Once he had gained entrance, he locked Shirley's 3 kids in the bathroom. There they were, screaming for their mother. Meanwhile, Shirley was being strangled to death in her bed, and BTK masturbated over her panties, once again leaving semen at the scene. Then he left, with the kids still in the bathroom. His target was Shirley. He seemed to have learned something from the Oteros, because besides KATHRYN Bright, he made sure that there was no man present during his attacks. Nancy Fox had no idea that she was being stalked, that the man responsible for 6 murders was watching her from a distance. Frothing from the mouth at the thoughts of what he would do to her, he was obsessed with her. Shirley Vian had been attacked in March of 1977, but BTK took some time off, until December of 1977. That's when it was Nancy Fox's turn. She was 25 years old when she died. Nancy Fox lived alone, so she was an easy target for BTK. She had gone home from her job at the jewelry store just like she did any other day, and there he was waiting inside her apartment. The police received a call that same night. The caller told them that they would find a homicide in Nancy's residence.
Dispatcher? Yes, you will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing. Nancy Fox. I'm sorry, sir, I can't understand you. What is the address? 843 South Pershing. That is correct.
Then he left the phone dangling in the booth as police rushed to the scene, and there she was. She had been bound, strangled to death, and her killer had masturbated onto her nightgown that was laying beside her, and once again he had left semen on it. The BTK killer had committed 7 murders, and it was time for him to once again go silent. But he wasn't all that silent, really. He sent another letter. This time he sent it to the TV station, and this time he finally claimed responsibility for the murder of KATHRYN Bright. This was in 1978. 4 years had passed since those first murders. In the letter he described the murders he had committed and wrote that he was to be called BTK, for bind, torture, kill. This caused a panic to such an extent that the local TV station even tried to subliminally affect the killer.
See any pattern to BTK's conduct?
We have an individual who apparently has the uncontrollable desire to kill at times.
What kind of leads do you have?
Well, very honestly, we have no solid leads.
Subliminal image was 1 or 2 frames that was spliced into videotape, and in it, it contained a couple of words. And what the psychological impact of that, we hoped, was that that image would be burned into BTK's brain. It sounds rather silly now, but 30 years ago, there was some credence to that.
Here's what went out on air.
Bright murder that occurred.
Here it is, slowed 50 times.
In the Nancy Fox sketch that he sent us was a pair of glasses that was lying upside down. And so what the behavioral science people came up with was a picture with a pair of glasses upside down, and it simply said, "Call the chief." It didn't work. He never did communicate.
But it didn't work, and BTK again went silent. This time he was gone for 7 years. The 70s faded out, and the 80s began. It was on April 27, 1985, that the BTK killer struck once again. The murder was horrible as it was. Maureen Hedge had gone home with a male companion, but she had no idea that the BTK killer already was inside. Once the man had left, BTK had jumped on top of her and choked her to death. She was found in a ditch by a road. The killer had taken the body from the house and done things to it. Things that wouldn't become clear until BTK was caught years later. And that is why we will revisit this crime just like all the others in the second half of the episode. One thing though that stood out from the other crimes was that the victim, Maureen Hedge, was 53 years old. More than a year went by, but on September 16, 1986, he returned for his penultimate victim, VICKI WEGERLE. She was at home with her son when BTK knocked on her door. He was dressed as a repairman, and so VICKI thought he was there to fix the phone line. He wasn't. He had at gunpoint forced her to submit to him, but she gave him a fight. She scratched and clawed at the killer, but he managed to subdue her and bind her. Then he strangled her to death. A short while later, Vicky's husband saw his family car drive on the road in the opposite direction, but could not identify the driver. As he arrived home, he found his son sitting in the living room watching television, but when he walked into the bedroom, his heart dropped. There she was, his wife, dead on the floor. BTK had struck again. 2 years later, on December 31st, 1988, a woman named Mary Fager was coming back home after visiting a family for a few days. When she opened her front door, she was assaulted by the horrible scene that had transpired. Her husband was bound and had been shot twice in the head. Her 9-year-old daughter was found naked, bound and strangled in the hot tub. Her eldest daughter, 16 years old, was found bound with electrical tape and drowned. Everyone thought that the BTK killer had come back, but he hadn't. And just like he needed to claim the murders he had committed, he felt the urge to set the public straight on the Fager family murders as well. So just as before, BTK sent in another letter. In this letter, he wrote that he did not kill the family, but that he admired the killer's work. He also sent an illustration of what he thought the scene may have looked like, but it was not accurate to the actual crime scene. I think it's clear that BTK did not commit this murder. He was an attention whore, so he would absolutely have claimed this massacre if he was responsible. The Fager family murders remains unsolved to this day. Again, silence. After the letter in '88, BTK had gone into one of his low-laying periods, but he could not remain silent for too long. His urges were too strong, and so in 1991, BTK committed his last murder. This time his victim was 62 years old Dolores Davis. Living alone, she was an easy target for BTK. He had strangled her and dumped her body beneath a bridge. Then he went back into the shadows again. The years went by. The new millennium began, and BTK had become a distant, bad memory. By 2004, he had been silent for 13 years. This time the public thought and hoped that he was gone for good. But then, in 2004, on the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders, the Wichita Eagle released an article about BTK, and a book was released about him. This angered BTK, who at this point had become an old man. He felt that they were trying to tell his story. So in response, he began sending letters again. The first letter was signed Bill Thomas Kilman, initials BTK. It had photocopies of photographs BTK had taken of VICKI WEGERLE, photos that he had posed her for on the crime scene. It was clear he was back. No one but the killer could have taken those. A short while later, he sent in another letter. This time it was a word puzzle. Then in the summer of 2004, a package was found taped onto a post in the middle of the city. Inside was a detailed description of the Otero murders, as well as a sketch of a naked woman bound. The killer had written, "The sexual thrill is my bill," on the letter as well. He had built up a correspondence now. 3 letters in a few months was a record for him. Later that same year, another package was found in the Wichita Public Library. This time it said that he was running out of time and that he was going to do another hit. The next 2 letters came in the fall of 2004. In both of them he tried to write his own biography of sorts, trying to give authorities false information about himself. He also had an image of children with bindings drawn on them, and one of the packages was a special case cereal box that he had written bomb on. In that one he wrote of the targets he was following, and that he was going to commit another murder soon. But he also made his first and most critical mistake in this box. He asked that if he sent in a floppy disk, if police could trace it. Later on, police would make sure to give him a response saying no, which of course was a lie, but BTK for some reason took their word for it. In January of 2005, he had dumped another box. This time there was a Barbie doll with rope bindings tied to her, and the rope was also tied to a pipe, a recreation of the Josephine Otero murder. In these letters, he also sent evidence like ID from the victims, to further prove that he was indeed BTK. But at this point, few people were questioning that. Then came the 10th letter, saying he was going to send a floppy disk, and the floppy disk arrived. It's kind of funny how things work themselves out. The FBI, police and all of that was high on his tail, but he was brought down by a floppy disk, the menacing BTK. The floppy disk was traced back to a church, made by a user named Dennis, and that's how they caught him. Dennis Rader was the BTK killer. A police contacted Dennis' daughter for a DNA sample, and once they had it, they could link him to the semen found on the crime scenes. Decades had gone by since the Otero family were murdered. Many more had died after them at the hands of Dennis Rader, but now they had him, and he was talkative. He really thought he was hot shit. But because he was so talkative, the details and motivations could finally become clear. The crimes that had before been in a dimly lit room was now laying bare underneath strong white light, illuminating the entire story. This may seem like an ending to a story. That's usually where my videos end, with an arrest. But this episode is different. This was the first half of the episode, the only half that people was aware of for decades. It may seem unnecessary to some, but perspective is important, and the second half is very different, but it's still the same story. So let's rewind the clock and talk about Dennis Rader. The story and perspective of the mysterious serial killer stalking Wichita was just as gruesome, scary and exciting as one would expect. But once he had been caught, Dennis Rader, we get to see the events that unfolded from a completely different perspective. I will throughout this half of the episode intercept my own narration with the confession audio of Dennis Rader himself. I will add context, insight and descriptions, but some things are just best explained by the psycho himself. This story is very far from over. Dennis Rader was born on March 9th, 1945. He was a withdrawn child, and many of his fellow students in school would say that he lacked a sense of humor. He was essentially the quiet kid. Rader have himself also stated that as a young boy, he would find stray animals and he would strangle them to death, a trait that he shares with a lot of serial killers and sadistic monsters out there. By 1965, Dennis Rader had entered college in Kansas. During this time, he had also begun breaking into homes and stealing panties that belonged to the homeowners. In this regard, he is similar to Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. The progression of Dennis Rader's criminal life went upwards. Just like Jeffrey Dahmer, in that regard he's not as unique as I'm sure he would like to think he is. and he really had no confusion about what it was. He was very aware. He had read books about serial killers. He had learned the terminology and traits of others. There was never any confusion as to what it was. He did everything with a purpose and knowledge. Dennis began serving in the Air Force between 1966 and 1970. It was in those years, as he, from the outside, was a decorated and honorable man, that he began prowling for prostitutes, and he was at this time also stalking women that caught his fancy. He did these things while stationed in Korea, Greece and Turkey. Then he came home. It was after he had come home that Dennis Rader met his future wife, Paula Dietz. The two of them married each other in 1971 and settled in Park City, Kansas. What Paula didn't know at that time was that Dennis Rader had began developing dark and twisted fantasies in his head. His life's work was about to begin. He knew in his head that he was better than the people around him. The people living their menial lives, doing their menial jobs. He was destined for greatness. And to him that greatness was going to come in the form of one of the worst serial killers in American history. Let me just be clear here though. These are my interpretations of what he himself was thinking based on what he has said and based on his psychology and behavior. A couple of years went by and it was now 1973. Dennis Rader had just been fired from his job and he was miserable. Up until this point he had kept the fantasies as just fantasies, but his miserable life spun his mind into corners he had kept locked in for some time. His sexual thoughts and fantasies grew worse and he began actively looking for a victim. He would troll around the neighborhoods looking for a suitable victim. At some point he laid eyes on Josephine Otero. And then the day came. Dennis Rader had been preparing for some time. He had brought what he called a hit kit with him. It consisted of knives, cords, guns and other things you might need when acting out your sexually deviated fantasies upon an 11-year-old girl. He knew that 3 of the children had left for school, but he also thought that the husband Joseph Otero had gone to work. In his mind he would force the wife and her 2 kids to be bound, but when he gained access that morning he was suddenly sprung into action because to his detriment Joseph Otero was home. He was quick on his feet though and pointed his gun at them. He told them that he was a wanted fugitive and that all he needed was some money and food. This was to calm the family while he could bind them. Here is Dennis Rader himself describing the events that unfolded on that morning in 1974. The description has been shortened by myself. I also would like to warn sensitive viewers as there will be some photos of the crime scene shown.
Somewhere between 7 and 7:30.
Did you know these people?
No, that was part of my, I guess my what you call fantasy. These people were selected.
You were engaged in some kind of fantasy during this period of time?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, when you use the term fantasy, is this something you were doing for your personal pleasure?
Sexual fantasy, sir.
I see.
I had did some thinking on what I was going to do to either Mrs. Otero or Josephine, and basically broke into the house, or didn't break into the house, but when they came out of the house, I came in and confronted the family, and then we went from there.
All right. Had you planned this beforehand?
To some degree, yes. After I got in the house, I lost control of it, but it was, you know, in the back of my mind, I had some ideas what I was going to do, but I basically panicked that first day, so.
Beforehand, did you know who was there in the house?
I thought Mrs. Otero and the 2 kids, the 2 younger kids were in the house. I didn't realize Mr. Otero was going to be there. Cut the phone lines, waited at the back door, had reservations about even going or just walking away, but pretty soon the door opened and I was in. I think one of the kids, I think the junior, or not junior, yes, the younger Joseph opened the door. He probably let the dog out because the dog was in the house at that time.
All right, when you went into the house, what happened then?
Well, I confronted the family, pulled a pistol, confronted Mr. Otero, and asked him to, you know, that I was there to basically I was wanted to get the car. I was hungry, food. I was wanted, and asked him to lie down in the living room. And at that time, I realized that wouldn't be a really good idea. So I finally, the dog was a real problem. So I asked Mr. Otero if he could get the dog out. So he had one of the kids put it out, and then I took him back to the bedroom.
You took who back to the bedroom?
The family, to the bedroom, the 4 members.
All right, what happened then?
At that time, I tied him up.
While still holding him at gunpoint?
Well, in between tying and yes. Yeah.
All right, after you tied them up, what occurred?
Well, they started complaining about being tied up, and I re-loosened the bonds a couple of times. Tried to make Mr. Otero as comfortable as I could. Apparently had a cracked rib from a car accident, so I had him put a pillow down for his head. They, you know, they talked to me about, you know, giving the car and whatever money. I guess they didn't have very much money, and there I realized that, you know, I didn't have a mask on or anything. They already could ID me, and made a decision to go ahead and put him down, I guess, or strangle him.
All right, what did you do to Joseph Otero Sr.?
Joseph Otero?
Yeah,
Okay.
Joseph Otero Sr., Mr. Otero, the father.
I put a plastic bag over his head and then some cords and tightened it.
And this was in the bedroom?
Yes, sir.
Did he, in fact, suffocate and die as a result of this?
Not right away. No, sir, he didn't.
What happened?
Well, after that, I did Mrs. Otero. I had never strangled anyone before, so I really didn't know how much pressure you had to put on a person or how long it would take. But
was she also tied up there in the
yes,
bedroom?
yeah, both her hands and their feet were tied up. She was on the bed.
Where were the children?
Well, Josephine was on the bed, and Junior was on the floor at this time.
So we're talking first of all about Joseph Otero. So you put the bag over his head and tied it, and he did not die right away. Can you tell me what happened in regards to Joseph?
He moved over real quick like, and I think tore a hole in the bag, and I could tell that he was having some problems there. But at that time, the whole family just went, they went panicked on me, so I worked pretty quick.
What did you, you worked pretty quick.
Well,
What
I mean,
did you do?
I strangled Mrs. Otero, and she went out, or passed out. I thought she was dead. She passed out. Then I strangled Josephine. She passed out, or I thought she was dead. And then I went over and put a bag on Junior's head. And
Sir, let me ask you about Joseph Otero Sr. You
Senior.
indicated he had torn a hole in the bag. And what did you do with him then?
I put another bag over it, or either that or I recollect, I think I put either a cloth or a T-shirt or something over his head, and then another bag.
Then,
okay.
Or did you go
First
back?
of all, Mr. Otero was strangled, or a bag put over his head and strangled. Then I thought he was going down, and I went over and strangled Mrs. Otero. I thought she was down. Then I strangled Josephine. Thought she was down. And then I went over to Junior and put the bag on his head. After that, Mrs. Otero woke back up, and you know, she was pretty upset and what's going on. So I came back, and at that point in time, strangled her for the death strangle at that time.
With your hands or what?
No, with a cord, with a rope. And then I think at that point in time, I redid Mr. Otero, put the bag over his head, went over, and then took Junior. Before that, she asked me to save her son. So I actually had taken the bag off, and then I was really upset at that point in time. So basically, when Mr. Otero was down, Mrs. Otero was down, I went ahead and took Junior. I put another bag over his head and took him to the other bedroom at that time.
What did you do then?
Put a bag over his head. I put a cloth over his head, a T-shirt, and a bag so he couldn't tear a hole in it. And he subsequently died from that. And then when I went back, Josephine had woke back up.
What did you do then?
And I took her to the basement and eventually hung her.
All right, you hung her in the basement?
Yes, sir.
Did you do anything else at that time?
Yes, I had some sexual fantasies, but that was after she was hung.
All right. What did you do then?
Went through the house, kind of cleaned it up. It's called the right-hand rule. You go from room to room. Picked everything up. I think I took Mr. Otero's watch. I guess I took a radio. I got the keys to the car. In fact, I had the keys, I think, earlier before that because I wanted to make sure I had a way of getting out of the house. And clean the house up a little bit, make sure everything's packed up.
It's a big debut to make, killing a family of 4 on your first crime. He had no experience of committing murder before this. The lack of experience caused him to make the mistake of striking when the husband was home, but somehow he overcame that. It's also worth noting here that Dennis Rader was no frail 60-year-old man with a horseshoe hairline. He was a lot younger and quicker on his feet in the physical aspect. But the mess didn't deter him. The cathartic moment of finally getting to act out his sexual fantasies was so strong, so compelling, that he just had to do it again. It was like he was an addict, and he would spend years trying to catch the feeling that first high had given him. He had other projects, as he called them, women he was watching and stalking, women that had caught his eye. One of those women were KATHRYN Bright. She was to be his next target, his next victim. In his head, he must have thought it was going to be a lot easier targeting KATHRYN. He had dealt with an entire family. How could he fail to kill one person? He had broken into her home, and he was waiting patiently. But again, he made a mistake. He didn't count on the fact that her brother Kevin Bright was with her. He had been sitting in the bedroom waiting for KATHRYN to come home when he heard her enter the house with Kevin. It was another situation where he had to act quickly, where he had to make a decision fast, or he would be toast. He would this time choose to act aggressively. As he heard the two voices, he rushed out of the bedroom with the gun cocked in his hand. He said the same things he had told the Oteros, that he was a wanted fugitive on the run. Again, I will let Rader himself describe the events that followed, and again, sensitive viewers, beware.
Deliberately and with premeditation by strangulation and stabbing, inflicting injuries from which she did die on April 4th, 1974. Can you tell me what occurred on that day?
I don't know how to exactly say that. I had many, what I call them projects. They were different people in the town that I followed, watched. KATHRYN Bright was one of the next targets, I guess, as I would indicate.
How did you select her?
Just driving by one day, and I saw her go in the house with somebody else, and I thought that's a possibility. There was many places in the area, College Hill, they're all over Wichita. But anyway, it just was basically a selection process. Work toward it. If it didn't work, I just move on to something else. But my kind of person is stalking and scrolling. You go through the trolling stage and then a stalking stage. She was in the stalking stage when this happened.
All right, sir. So you identified KATHRYN Bright as a potential victim.
Yes, sir.
What did you do here in Sedgwick County then?
Pardon?
What did you do then here in Sedgwick County?
On this particular day,
yes.
I broke into the house and waited for her to come home.
How did you break into the house?
Through the back door on the east side.
All right, and you waited for her to come home. Where
Yes,
did
sir.
you wait?
In the house there, probably close to the bedroom. I walked through the house and kind of figured out where I'd be if they came through.
All right. What happened then?
She and Kevin Bright came in. I wasn't expecting him to be there. And come find out, I guess they were related. That time I approached him and told him I was wanted California. Needed some car. Basically the same thing that I told the Oteros. Kind of ease them, make them feel better, and proceeded to. I think I had him tie her up first, and then I tied him up, or vice versa. I don't remember right now. At that time.
Let me ask. You indicated you had some items to tie these people with. Did you bring these items, both the Oteros and to this location?
The Oteros I did. I'm not really sure on the Brights. If I had brought my stuff and used my stuff, Kevin would probably be dead today. I'm not bragging on that. It's just a matter of fact. It's the bonds I tied him up with that he broke them. So,
all right.
And maybe same way with KATHRYN. It got out of hand.
All right. Now you indicated that you believe you had Kevin tie KATHRYN up. Tell me what happened then.
Okay. I moved. After. I really can't remember, Judge, whether I had her tie him up or she tied him up. But anyway, I moved her to another bedroom, and he was already secure there by the bed. Tied his feet to the bedpost, on the bedpost, so he couldn't run. Kind of tied her in the other bedroom, and then I came back to strangle him. And at that time, we had a fight.
Were you armed with a handgun at that time also?
Yes, I had a handgun.
What happened when you came back?
I actually had two handguns. When I started strangling, either the parent broke or he broke his bonds, and he jumped up real quick like. I pulled my gun and quickly shot him, hit him in the head. He fell over. I could see the blood, and as far as I was concerned, I thought he was down and was out, and then went and started to strangle KATHRYN. And we started fighting because the bonds weren't very good, and so back and forth we fought.
You and KATHRYN?
Yeah, we fought, and I got the best of her, and I thought she was going down, and then I could hear some movement in the other room. So I went back, and Kevin, no, I thought she was going down, and I went back to the other bedroom where Kevin was at, and I tried to re-strangle him at that time, and he jumped up, and we fought, and he at that time shot me because he got my pistol that was in my shoulder here. I had my Magnum in my shoulder, so
shoulder holster. Did you have it in a shoulder holster?
Yes, and I had the Magnum in my shoulder holster. The other one was a 22, and we fought at that point in time, and I thought it was going to go off. I jammed the gun, stuck my finger in there, jammed it, and I think he thought that was the only gun I had, because once I either bit his finger or hit him or something got away, and I used the 22 and shot him one more time. And I thought he was down for good that time.
All right, so you shot him a second time.
Yes, sir.
What happened then?
Went back to finish the job on KATHRYN, and she was fighting. And at that point in time, I'd been fighting her, and then I heard I don't know whether I was basically losing control. The strangulation wasn't working on her, and I used a knife on her.
You say you used a knife on her.
Yes.
What did you do with the knife?
I stabbed her. She said either stabbed 2 or 3 times, either here or here. Maybe 2 back here and 1 here, or maybe just 2 times back here.
You were pointing to your lower back and
your underneath the ribs.
And your lower abdomen.
Yeah, underneath the ribs, up underneath the ribs.
So after you stabbed her, what happened?
Actually, I think at that point in time, well, it was a total mess because I didn't have control on it. She was bleeding. She went down. I think I just went back to check on Kevin, or at that basically same time I heard him escape. It could be one of the two. But all of a sudden the front door of the house was open and he was gone. And I tell you what I thought. I thought the police were coming at that time. I heard the door open. I thought, no, that's it. And I stepped out there, and I could see him running down the street. So I quickly cleaned up everything that I could.
Once again, Dennis had miscalculated the situation, but he had gotten his kill. One thing that is compelling about Dennis Rader is the fact that his sexual fantasies were almost more stimulated by the preparation for the crimes, rather than the murders themselves. The murders was the orgasm, but the trolling, stalking and planning of his projects were like the edging. It was this feeling he looked for more than any other. After the murder of KATHRYN Bright, Dennis Rader fell back into the shadows. He knew he would kill again, but not now. Dennis finally got a steady job for a security installation business in 1975, and even though he didn't kill or attack anyone during this time, he was still doing his stalking. He had his eyes set on several women in the neighborhoods he prowled, and then in the spring of 1977, he knew it was time to kill once again. The murder of Shirley Vian wasn't really supposed to take place that day. Dennis Rader had been stalking another one of his targets, a woman named Cheryl. He had met Cheryl in a bar and was immediately struck by her. She was a definitive hit, but as Dennis waited inside Cheryl's apartment that day, he realized something. Cheryl wasn't coming. He wasn't gonna sit there forever, so he went out and started walking around the neighborhood on foot. That's when he met 5-year-old Steve. 2 years earlier, in 1975, Dennis Rader and his wife had their first baby together. And so Dennis, in an attempt to befriend little Steve, showed the young boy a photo of his wife and son. He asked the young boy if he had seen them or if he knew where they were. Of course, Steve said no, but as the little kid made his way home, Dennis Rader followed. Steve wasn't Dennis' target. He was just a tool Dennis used to get to his target, Steve's mother, Shirley Vian. Soon Dennis Rader knocked on the Vian household's front door and Steve opened. Having established trust earlier, Dennis now told the young boy he was a detective, and so he gained access into the home. The events that unfolded after that is best explained by the man who committed them.
Actually, on that one, she was completely random. There was actually someone across from Dylan's was a potential target. It was called Project Green, I think. I had project numbers assigned to it. And that particular day, I drove to Dylan's, parked in the parking lot, watched this particular residence, and then got out of the car and walked over, knocked. Nobody answered it. So I was all keyed up, so I just started going through the neighborhood. I'd been through the neighborhood before. I kind of knew a little of the layout of the neighborhood. I've been through the back alleys, knew where some certain people live. While I was walking down Hydraulic, I met a young boy and asked him if he ID some pictures. Kind of as a rust, I guess, or roost, as you call it, and kind of feel it out. And saw where he went, and I went to another address and knocked on the door. Nobody opened the door, so I just noticed where he went and went to that house, and we went from there.
Now you call these projects, were these sexual fantasies also?
Potential hits. Yeah, in my world, that's what I call them.
So
They're
you
called
went,
projects, hits.
all right, and why did you have these potential hits? Was this to gratify some sexual interest? Or?
Yes, sir. I had a lot of them, so it's just, if one didn't work out, I just moved to another one.
All right. So, as I'm to understand it, then on the 17th of March, 1977, you saw this little boy go into a residence. You tried another residence, no one was there, so you went to the residence with the little boy.
And I watched where he went.
What happened then?
After I tried this once residence, nobody came to the door. I went to this house where he went in, knocked on the door, and told him I was a private detective. Showed him a picture that I had just showed the boy, and asked him if they could ID the picture. And at that time, I had the gun here, and I just kind of forced myself in. I just walked in, just opened the door and walked in. I told Mrs. Vian that I had a problem with sexual fantasies, that I was going to tie her up, and that I might have to tie the kids up, and that she would cooperate with me at that time. We went back. She was extremely nervous. I think she even smoked a cigarette. And we went back to one of the back areas of the porch, explained to her that I had done this before. And I think at that point in time, I think she was sick because she had her night robe on. I think if I remember right, she had been sick. And I think she came out of the bedroom when I went in the house. So anyway, we went back to her bedroom, and I proceeded to tie the kids up, and they started crying and got real upset. So I said, "Oh, this is not going to work." So we moved them to the bathroom. She helped me, and then I tied the doors shut. We put some toys and blankets and odds and ends in there for the kids, make them as comfortable as we could. We tied one of the bathroom doors shut so they couldn't open it, and she went back and helped me shove the bed up against the other bathroom door. And then I proceeded to tie her up. She got sick, threw up, got her a glass of water, comforted her a little bit, and then I went ahead and tied her up, and then put a bag over her head and strangled her.
All right. Was this a plastic bag also?
Yes, sir. I think it was, but I could be wrong in that.
You put a bag.
It was something. I'm sure it was plastic bag. Yeah.
You say you put a bag over her head and strangled her. What did you strangle her with?
I actually, I think on that, I had tied her legs to the bedpost and worked up with the rope all the way up, and then what I had left over, I looped over her neck.
All right, so you used this rope to strangle her.
Yes, I think it's the same one that I tied her body with.
What happened then?
Well, the kids were really banging on the door, hollering, screaming, and then the telephone rang, and they had talked about earlier that the neighbor was going to check on them, so I cleaned everything up.
Locking the children in the bathroom had not been something that Dennis did to save them. He was planning on killing them too, but according to him, a ringing telephone had startled him and caused him to leave before he could harm them. A short time later, the 3 terrified children managed to break out of the bathroom and run for help. Dennis felt satisfied, but he also felt underwhelmed. He wanted more time with his victims. He wanted to pose them, photograph them, and make memories that could sustain him for years. But as per usual, Dennis Rader took some mementos from this murder as well. A trophy, as they're called. Spring turned into summer, summer became fall, and then as winter had begun on December 8th, 1977, Dennis Rader decided to strike his next victim. Her name was Nancy Fox. Dennis had been stalking her for some time. She had really caught his fancy, and he just had to have her. Unfortunately, his idea of having her meant that she had to die. Nancy lived alone and was working in a jewelry store. That day was just like any other, except for the fact that Dennis Rader was waiting for her.
When I was trolling the area, I noticed her go in the house one night. Sometimes anyway, I put her down as a potential victim.
Let me ask you one thing, Mr. Rader. You used that term when you were patrolling the area. What do you mean by that?
It's called stalking or trolling.
So you were not working in any form or fashion. You
Well,
were just...
I don't know if you read much about serial killers, they go through what they call the different phases. That's one of the phases they go through as a trolling stage. Basically you're looking for a victim at that time, and that you could be trolling for months or years. But once you lock in on a certain person, then you become stalking, and that might be several of them. But you really home in on that person. They basically become that's the victim.
Basically identified Nancy Fox as one of your projects. What happened then?
At first, she was spotted, and then I did a little homework. I dropped by once to check the mailbox to see what her name was. Found out where she worked. Stopped by there once. About 2 or 3 blocks away, I parked my car and walked to that residence. Knocked at the door first to make sure, see if anybody was in there, because I knew she arrived home at a particular time from where she worked. Nobody answered the door, so I went around to the back of the house, cut the phone lines. I could tell that there wasn't anybody in the north apartment. Broke in and waited for her to come home in the kitchen.
All right. Did she come home?
Yes, she did.
What happened?
I confronted her, told her there I had a problem, sexual problems, that I would have to tie her up and have sex with her. She was a little upset. We talked for a while. She smoked a cigarette. While we smoked a cigarette, I went through her purse, identifying some stuff. And she finally said, well, let's get this over with so I can go call the police. I said, okay. And she said, can I go to the bathroom? And I said, yes. She went to the bathroom, came, and I told her when she came out to make sure that she was undressed. And when she came out, I handcuffed her, and I don't really remember whether. Sir?
You handcuffed her? You had a pair of handcuffs?
Yes, sir.
What happened there?
Well, anyway, I handcuffed her, had her lay on the bed, and then I tied her feet, and I was also undressed to a certain degree, and then I got on top of her, and then I reached over, took either her feet were tied or not tied. But anyway, I think I had a belt. I took the belt and then strangled her with the belt at that time. After I strangled her with the belt, I took the belt off and retied that with pantyhose, real tight. Removed the handcuffs and tied those with pantyhose. Can't remember the colors right now. I think I maybe retied her feet. What they had not already, they were probably already tied. Her feet were, and at that time masturbated, sir.
Had you had sexual relations with her?
No,
before?
no. I told her I was, but I did not.
So you masturbated, then what did you do?
Dressed and then went through the house, took some of her personal items, and kind of cleaned the house up with her and checked everything.
One thing Rader did not mention in this confession is what he told Nancy Fox just before he murdered her. He told her that he was the BTK killer, that he was the man responsible for 6 murders. For some reason he needed her to know, almost as if that made her death mean something more in his eyes. Because it really wasn't necessary to tell her that, since he was going to kill her anyway, but it did. One thing that also reveals his sexually sadistic fantasies is the fact that he didn't have sex with the victims. The fantasies were just the process of stalking, binding and killing. It was the ultimate degradation, and masturbating over their corpses was the ultimate dominance for Dennis Rader. Just a sick, vile piece of shit human being overall. It has been said that something happened here though, in the late 1970s. I cannot confirm this, but it was depicted in the 2nd season of the Netflix show Mindhunter. The event that transpired is said to have been Dennis Rader's wife walking in on him in the bathroom while he was taking one of his bondage-like photos. He had tied a rope to the door handle and tied a noose around his neck, wearing female clothing and a plastic female mask, and he had a camera set up to take photographs. This was his idea of creating scenarios of vulnerable women in scenes of absolute submission. He would take these pictures often. He would set up all manners of different mechanics and bindings that he photographed himself in, wearing that creepy plastic mask and the female clothing. In some photos he was naked, and to keep the fantasy realistic, he tucked his cock and balls between his legs, creating what's known as a fruit bowl. He would then look at these photos, imagine that it was a woman in bondage and not a naked hairy man with his junk tucked between his thighs, and he would masturbate. But back to the unconfirmed event that shook up Dennis Rader's predatory lifestyle. Being caught by his wife in one of his contraptions wearing the mask and the clothes would have taken a lot of explaining. Paula, Dennis' wife, didn't want to deal with that. They were a family and they had children. The problem needed fixing. This caused Dennis to go into one of his inactive periods, and it's said that this event was the reason for that pause in madness. This happened in the middle of the couple having their 3rd child as well. I do not know when this thing happened, but Dennis had set his eyes on another one of his targets in 1979. I do imagine that the bathroom incident happened after Dennis' attempted attack on Anna Williams. That makes sense to me. The hit on Anna Williams, 63 years old, was to be carried out in April of 1979. But as Dennis Rader was waiting in Anna Williams' home, the hours went by. He realized she wasn't going to come home, and he was deeply disappointed. Dennis stole a few things and left the house. But he wasn't going to let her get off that easily. Shortly afterwards, a package arrived in Anna's mailbox. It had a poem titled, "Oh Anna, why didn't you appear?" as well as drawings, depictions of what Dennis would have done to her if she was home. The package also contained the items he had stolen. Anna packed her things and moved far away from Kansas. He had inflicted terror in Anna, and he had also at this point sent one of his letters to the TV station. But again, Dennis Rader crouched beneath the radar, staying away from the public eye for 6 years. During these years in the early 80s, Dennis Rader's private life was evolving. He was becoming an active member of the church, and his son joined the Boy Scout club, and Dennis himself became one of the Boy Scout leaders. He was a respectable citizen in the eyes of the public, a good church-going scout club leading civilian. But inside he still had the desires. He still trolled and watched the women that caught his eye. Maureen Hedge had been one of Dennis Rader's neighbors for years when he was living in Parkland City. He knew her and he had his eyes set on her. The thing that adds a special twang of sadism to this crime, though, isn't just the murder in and of itself. It's the context around it that makes your skin crawl. Dennis Rader was with the Boy Scouts out doing their thing when he excused himself and said that he needed to leave temporarily. So he went to a bowling alley, bought a beer, swished it around in his mouth, purposely spilling some on his shirt, all to make it look like he was drunk. Then he hailed a cab. His plan was to get to Maureen Hedges' home, and eventually he did. Dennis Rader had left his position as the leader of the Boy Scouts to bind and strangle a woman to death. I will play Dennis Rader's description of the events, but first I want to say something about what he did. You see, after Dennis had murdered Maureen Hedge, 53 years old, he put her body in the trunk of his car, drove to the church, and after he had carried her corpse into the church, he posed her body in several positions, nude, dead. He took photos of it. He was going to relive this one for a long time. It was all about the absolute domination and degradation he wanted. He hadn't been able to play with his victims before, but this time he could. Now he had the time to create what he always had envisioned in his head. Now I will let Dennis Rader confess to what he did to Maureen Hedge on April 27th, 1985.
Well, actually, kind of like the others, she was chosen. I went through the different phases, stalking phase, and since she lived down the street from me, I could watch the coming and going quite easily. On that particular date, I had another commitment, came back from that commitment, parked my car at a bowling alley there at that time. Before that, I dressed until I had some other clothes on, changed clothes. I went to the bowling alley, went in there, the precincts of bowling, called a taxi, had a taxi take me out to Park City. Had my kit with me, there's a bowling bag.
All right, that was Park City in Sedgwick County,
yes,
Kansas?
Sir.
All right, you had the taxi take you to Park City. What happened there?
There, I pretended that I was a little drunk. I just took some beer and forced it around my mouth, and the guy could probably smell the alcohol on me. I told him to let me out so I could get some fresh air, and I walked from where the taxi let me off over to her house.
All right, where does she live?
62, 42, 54, 62, 54, 62, 54, North Independence.
All right, when you walked over there, what happened next?
Well, as before, I was going to have sexual fantasies, so I brought my hit kit, and lo and behold, her car was there. I thought, gee, she's not supposed to be home. So I very carefully snuck into the house, kind of like a cat burglar, and after checking the house, she wasn't there. So about that time, the doors rattled, so I went back to one of the bedrooms and hid back there in one of the bedrooms. She came in with a male visitor. They were there for maybe an hour or so. He left. I waited till wee hours in the morning, and then proceeded to sneak into her bedroom and flip the lights on real quick, or I think the bathroom lights. I didn't want to flip her lights on, and she screamed, and I jumped on the bed and strangled her manually.
All right. Now, were you wearing any kind of disguise or mask at this time?
No, no.
You indicated this woman lived down the street from you. Did she know you?
Casually, we'd walk by and wave. She liked to work in her yard as well as I liked to work. It's just a neighborly type thing. It wasn't anything personal. I mean, just a neighbor.
All right, so she was in her bed when you turned on the lights in the bathroom?
Yeah, the bathroom, yeah, so I could get some light in there.
All right, what did you do then?
No, I manually strangled her when she started to scream.
So you used your hands?
Yes, sir.
And you strangled her? Did she die?
Yes.
All right, what did you do then?
After that, since I was in the sexual fantasy, I went ahead and stripped her, and probably went ahead and, I'm not sure if I tied her up at that point in time, but anyway, she was nude, and I put her on a blanket, went through her purse, some personal items in the house, figured out how I was going to get her out of there. Eventually moved her to the trunk of the car, took the car over to Christ Lutheran Church. This is with the older church, and took some pictures of her.
Did you keep those photographs?
Yes, the police probably have them.
All right, what happened there?
That was it. She went through, I tied it, she was already dead, so I took pictures of her in different forms of bondage, and that's probably what got me in trouble was the bondage thing. So anyway, that's probably the main thing. But anyway, after that, I moved her back out to the car, and then we went east on 53rd.
After the murder and disposal of her corpse, he returned to the Boy Scout camp. It was now light out, and Dennis Rader went with his duties as if nothing had happened. Like before, Dennis Rader let some time go by. He wasn't a spree killer. He had these long hiatuses. Some of them were only a couple of months long, and some of them spanned years. VICKI WEGERLE was his next target. He had been walking by her house when he had heard piano music playing. That's how she caught his eye, and from that moment on, she had a target painted on her back. Just like I described in the first half, Dennis Rader impersonated a telephone repairman to gain access to her home. Then as he was trying to strangle her, she fought him fiercely, scratching at him, doing anything to escape what was about to happen. But Dennis Rader overpowered her. He was now about 40 years old. He wasn't as young and spry as he used to be, but he was always prepared. After he had strangled her, he positioned her body, took a few photos to remember the day, and then he went on his way. He later stated that he would have killed the husband too if he had come home just a few minutes earlier. Vicki's husband found her corpse laying on the floor behind the bed, and this is Dennis Rader's explanation of what transpired that day.
VICKI WEGERLE did die on September 16th, 1986. Can you tell me what you did here in Sedgwick County on that day that makes you believe you are guilty?
Again, VICKI WEGERLE was another potential victim. I went through those different phases, locked in on her, as I would call it, and decided that I would try that date. I used a ruse as a telephone repairman to get in their house. Drove there in my own personal car around lunchtime, during lunch hour, or approximately that time. It was earlier in the morning than that. And I actually went somewhere else and changed my clothes, what I call my hit clothes. And,
hit clothes?
Hit clothes. Basically different, things that I'd need to get rid of later. Not the same kind of clothes I had on. I don't know what other better word to use it, crime clothes or hit clothes. I just call it hit clothes. Anyway, I walked from my car as a telephone repairman. As I walked there, I donned the telephone helmet. I had a briefcase. Went to one other address just to kind of size up the house. I'd walked by it a couple times, but I wanted to check it a little bit more. As I approached it, I could hear a piano sound. And went to this other door, knocked on them, and told them that we were recently working on telephone repairs in the area. I went to her and knocked on the door and asked her if I could come check her telephone lines inside.
Did she allow you in?
Yes, she did.
What happened then?
I went over and found out where the telephone was, simulated that I was checking the telephone. I had a make-believe instrument. And after she was looking away, I drew a pistol at her and asked her if she'd go back to the bedroom with me.
Is this the same 357 Magnum you used?
No, this was a different
pistol. All right, you asked her to go back to the bedroom with you after drawing a pistol.
Yes, sir.
What happened then?
I told her, we went back to the bedroom, I told her I was going to have to tie her up. She was very upset, and I think I used some material that was in, and that's another thing, I'm not sure, but I think I used the material that they had in their bedroom, and after I tied her hands, she broke that and we started fighting, and we fought quite a bit back and forth.
All right, she was physically fighting you?
Oh, yeah. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
What happened then?
Finally got the hand on her and got a nylon sock and started strangling her.
So you wrapped the stocking around her neck?
Yes.
What happened then?
I finally gained on her and put her down, and I thought she was dead, but apparently she wasn't. But after she was down and not moving anymore, I rearranged her clothes a little bit and took some quick photos. I think 3 of them, if I remember. And then after that, there was a lot of commotion. She had mentioned something about her husband coming home, so I got out of there pretty quick. The dogs were raising a lot of cane in the back. The doors, the windows were all open to the house. There was a lot of noise when we were fighting. So I left pretty quickly after that. Put everything in the briefcase and had her. I'd already gone through her purse and got the keys to the car.
For 18 years, the people and detectives of Wichita looked at Vicky's husband with suspicion. They all blamed him and thought he was responsible. It wasn't until BTK claimed the murder for himself that the husband was cleared, but the damage had already been done again and again for 18 years. By the time he was truly innocent in the eyes of the public, his son was a grown man. It was time for yet another hiatus. He had by now claimed 9 lives, and by the early 90s he managed to get himself fired from his job as an alarm installer. He was still stalking though. He still had his projects, but now he was wary of younger women and women with males that might accompany them. He viewed the lonely older women as more vulnerable, and by 1991 he had set his eyes on his last project. Her name was Dolores Davis, and she was 63 years old. She only lived a couple of miles away from Dennis Rader, so his stalking of Dolores was made a bit easier. It was a cold night, February 1st, 1991. Dennis was out on another scouting trip that night, and once again found an excuse to leave for the night. It didn't raise suspicion though, as these exits only were made a couple of times with several years apart. But he drove to his parents' home, changed out of his scout uniform into his so-called hit clothes. He then parked his car by the church and made his way to Dolores' house on foot. He knew that she would be alone and vulnerable. Dolores had ruined his fantasy though, because as she was laying there on the bed bound, she told him that she expected company, and this sprung Dennis Rader into action. He killed her and carried her body into the trunk of her car, and drove out and dumped the body and evidence under some leaves and trees. He then returned to wipe the scene clean. He returned to the scout camp, and the following night he slipped away again. This time he posed Dolores' corpse for some photos before leaving it. He also at some point shortly after the murder took a photo of himself wearing that horrible mask in a grave he said he had dug for Dolores. This is what happened that night, in the words of Rader himself.
Particular day I had some commitments. I left those, went to one place, changed my clothes, went to another place, parked my car, finally made arrangements on my hit kit, my clothes, and then walked to that residence. After spending some time at that residence, it was very cold at night. Had reservations about going in. I had cased the place before, and I really couldn't figure out how to get in, and she was in the house, so I finally just selected a concrete block and threw it through the plate glass window on the east and came on in.
All right, so you used a concrete block to break the window?
Mm-hmm. Plate glass window, patio door. Mm-hmm.
What happened then?
noise. I just went in. She came out of the bedroom and thought that a car had hit her house. And I told her that I used the roofs of being wanted. I was on the run. I needed food, car, warm up. And I asked her, I handcuffed her and kind of talked to her, told her that I would like to get some food, get her keys to her car, and kind of rest assured, talk with her a little bit, and calmed her down a little bit. And then eventually I checked, I think she was still handcuffed. I went back and checked out where the car was, stimulated getting some food, odds and ends in the house that Alika was leaving. Then went back and removed her handcuffs and then tied her up, and then eventually strangled her.
Or you say eventually strangled her?
Well, after I tied her up, I went through some things in the room there and then strangled her.
You say you went through, were you looking for something?
Mm-hmm. Well, some personal items, yes. I took some personal items from there.
Did you take personal items in every one of these incidents?
I did on the hedge. I don't remember anything at Vicky's place. The Oteros, we got the watch and the radio. I don't think I did any at Bright's.
All right, so in regard to the Davis matter, you went around the room, took a few personal things. What did you do then?
Strangled her.
What did you strangle her with?
Pantyhose.
All right, what happened then?
Kind of like Mrs. Hedge. I already figured out I had a plan on leaving and put her in a blanket and drug her to the car and put her in the trunk of the car.
So you were able to strangle her to death with these pantyhose?
Yes, sir.
All right, you put her in your car.
In her car. Her car. The trunk of her car.
What happened then?
I really had a commitment I needed to go to, so I moved her to one spot, took her out of her car. This gets complicated. Then the stuff I had, clothes, gun, whatever, I took that to another spot in her car, dumped that off. Okay. Then took her car back to her house, left that, let me think now. Okay, in the interim, I took her car back to her house. In the interim, I realized that I had lost one of my guns. I dropped it somewhere. So I was trying to figure out where my gun was. So I went back in the house, realized I had dropped it when I broke the plate glass window. It dropped and fell on the floor right there, and I found it right there. So that solved that problem. Anyway, I went back out, threw the keys, checked the car real quick, threw the keys up on top of the roof of her house, walked from her car back to my car, took my car, drove it back, and I either dropped more stuff off or I picked her up and put them in my car. And then I drove up northeast of Sedgwick County.
That was Dennis Rader's last murder. A few months after that, he became an animal control officer, and this enabled him to use his position of authority to dominate and degrade. He would write citations after citations to certain women. One woman told the story of how Dennis Rader had put her dog down for a phony citation. He was sadistic, and he loved to abuse his role. Over time, it became sort of a substitute for his fantasies. Dennis was getting older, his children was grown up, they were adults, no more Boy Scout meetings. But then came 2004, the 30-year anniversary of the Otero murders, and articles and books were written. Internet forums took attention to the correspondence that Rader was carrying out, but just like I said before, he sent one too many letters. Sending them that floppy disk was a huge mistake. Dennis Rader was finally caught in 2005, and he sang like a bird. He loved telling the stories of the crimes he had committed. He was proud of them. To him, everyone could now see him for who he really was. The 10 unsolved murders he had committed over the 3 decades was solved. He remains in prison to this day. Dennis Rader is a garbage human being, and he should probably be brought out back and shot in the neck until he bleeds out. But he is a very interesting example. It seems to me almost like he had these urges and he knew what they were. He knew what he was. And he decided to use his urges and fantasies to his advantage, to create a serial killer that would be named among Jack the Ripper, the Zodiac Killer, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, and David Berkowitz, the legends, the ones that have carved out their own place in history by committing murder. BTK wanted to be one of them, because if he had these urges anyway, why not use them to your advantages? So many serial killers go unnoticed in history. Some of them I have covered myself. No one really knows who they are. But if I say BTK, you will know. You will know the B is for bind, the T is for torture, and that the K is for kill. What Dennis Rader did is despicable, but in a way he accomplished his goals. And he can celebrate that while rotting away in his cell, lonely and old. No women to arrest there, no photos of himself in contraptions or photos of post corpses he can jerk off to. I wonder if he truly regrets what he did. I really doubt it. I don't think he's capable of it. He says he is sorry, but it's shallow, just empty words floating out of his mouth. They mean nothing. Dennis Rader thought he was slick. He thought he was the one in control, until a floppy disk brought the old man down. Bask in the infamy all you want, Dennis. You're gonna rot away and become another scary story. You'll never be free again.
So all of these incidents, these 10 counts, occurred because you wanted to satisfy a sexual fantasy, is that correct?
Yes.
Dennis L. Rader, guilty of murder in the first degree in count 1, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 2, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 3, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 4, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 5, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 6, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 7, a Class A felony, murder in the first degree in count 8, a Class A felony,